Hello everyone and welcome to our 6th critique. Wow, I can't believe that already. If you guys can hear me, just type in the chat box, say hello if you're in here. Before we get started, while we wait for a few people to kind of log in, does anybody have any questions for me? Hi Stella. So if you guys have any questions before we begin, I don't know if any of you tuned in this morning, but I mentioned that the new lesson is available to watch. And this week we are going to be putting on like the final details. Hi Brenda, hi Penny. So we're going to be putting on the final details on the face. But just because the lesson is released this weekend doesn't mean by next weekend that you have to have that stage done. Kind of from here on out, everyone's going to be at kind of different stages. And that's okay. Just, make sure you work consistently each week and, follow up with each lesson, with each layer. And our final critique is on the 15th of next month. Let me double check that that's right. Yes. So we have 3 more critiques before you want to have your painting finished. So don't feel if you're falling a little behind, don't worry. Just keep progressing on your portrait with each layer. And kind of coming up, like this weekend, you had the lesson on the final pass on the face, including putting eyelashes on and the highlights. Beneath that video, check the download section. Because I put in some high-res pictures and close-ups of the face because the video camera didn't quite pick up some of the nuances in the highlights, probably because they were so high-key. You can kind of see them through parts of the video, but I feel like the pictures show a little bit more variety. So I gave you guys that so that you could see it a little more clearly and refer back to it when I talk about adding a variety of colors to use for your highlights. So I think that was pretty much it. Oh, and then, kind of leading up, we're going to do things like finish the hair, finish the shirt, do a little bit of background work, and then I'll have a video on the end about bringing a polish to your work, and I'm going to actually do a video on how to varnish your painting, because I know a lot of people have questions about that, so I'm going to go ahead and cover that in the class as well. So let's go ahead and jump in. Brenda, are you in here? Oh, yeah, there you are. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with you. So I just want to ask you before we start, if the color on the screen of your painting feels similar to the way your painting feels in real life. If it looks too warm, too bright, or too cool, just let me know and I'll try to make some adjustments before we jump in. And it's too warm. Okay, so let's go ahead and adjust that real quick. So if it's too warm, it probably has too much yellow. So we'll take out some of that, and then probably too much red. Find a kind of happy ground. I use the background color as a kind of a guide, somewhat. Does that look a little bit better? And what about the brightness? It could be maybe just, it looks a little blown out in that brightest highlight on the forehead. And I'm thinking that's probably the picture. Is that a little bit better? Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. All right, so if you have specific questions, Brenda, go ahead and type them in the chat, but I'm going to go ahead and just get started. I'm going to make a few notes in one layer of some drawing corrections, to make, and then we'll get into talking about some of the color. Just a few things that we'll want to make sure you work on shifting as you add that second and third layer. Even though I think it was between my first color layer and my second color layer, I had made some drawing adjustments to the mouth in my painting. You can do that, you know, kind of moving forward. So just because, you know, you've done the first color pass or finished even the second color pass doesn't mean you can't continue to tweak the drawing if you feel dissatisfied with it. So I'm going to pull this picture a little closer so I can see. All right. So one thing I'm noticing is just the mouth feels a little bit short on this right side. And I'm going to just draw a line straight up here. Let me get a thinner line. So I just want to see how that's lining up with the eyes. Okay, something like that. And then this corner on the left side is kind of tricky because it goes real dark right there, and I would say that's the corner, but then she has this little secondary shadow. I'm going to go based on that corner there. And just check those points. So this one, I think, is the one that has the issue. It's a little bit short. This one probably is okay. I would say that's probably where you have your corner and that this is some of that shadow shape. Let me know if I'm mistaken on that, but that's what it kind of looks like to me. So make sure that your color doesn't come straight down to that corner. Make sure the colored portion of the lip comes down and meets here, and that you just have a little triangle of a shadow color. And it shouldn't look like the lip color. It should be kind of an orangey skin tone. So my feeling with this is that the that the corner of the mouth should probably come out to about there. Just a little bit further, so that way it kind of, you can see that it starts to hit right around where that eye curves. So I would extend the mouth a little bit and give yourself a little bit wider space there. And then as a result, you can clarify where that arc in the Cupid's bow is. So it might need to shift over just based on where the center of the nose is. It doesn't line up perfectly, as you can see. There's a slight kind of tilt relationship. Let me do that again, a little better. So you can see there's a slight tilt between the center of the septum on the nose and where the peak is here. But yours might be just slightly off center. So just make sure you pay attention to that. I think if you make sure that dip in the mouth is there, you're probably okay. Okay, so that's the main thing with the mouth. I think actually your arc here is perfect. That feels good. So just drop that corner. That's the main one. And then let's look in the eyes a little bit. What I noticed with this one is that you have more of an elliptical, and then this one is more like kind of rounded. And I think this one just got a little narrow. So I think if you just went in and made sure you rounded that out and maybe a touch, pull it out just a little bit more on that left side. It's not a huge difference, but it'll help. And then with this eye, maybe trim in just a little bit at the bottom. All you'd have to do is take your white of the eye and just kind of round that off a little bit towards the bottom. and that should help correct some of that shape. So my feeling with the features is that maybe like in the nose here, you could watch some of the light values that you place here. So kind of think of this side plane, even though there is some reflected light and a little bit of light hitting that top of that nostril, it still kind of merges with the shadow shape. Like if you zoom way out and you look at that picture, you can't quite see as much of a distinction for that little light on the nostril as you do see in your painting. So try making this little segment a value step or two down. Okay, so you haven't redone the eyes and you were waiting to play with the color and realize. Okay, so yeah, that's fine. Like I said, everyone's kind of at a different stage right now, so don't worry about it. Just keep working. You know, if you're still working on your second pass, then and you haven't done the features for that second pass, that's okay. Just continue working on that and just keep me up to date on what stage you're at when you submit for homework. Okay, so the only other thing I'm noticing, you have really beautiful colors here, by the way. I don't think I said that, but I really like the combination that you're pushing. This color combination here and kind of moving up is really beautiful. I think what I'm noticing is that her face, almost her shadow shape, feels like it's out here. And it's making her face feel very round, especially on that side. So I think what needs to happen, if you kind of look where this angle change happens, it lines up with the eye. And it looks like you have some of that, but it's more in the green. So what I think needs to happen is that you need to bring your shadow, this shadow color, this one, the brown, in a little bit. Something like that. And I'll do a paint over so you can see what I mean. What that might do is that you're going to have to find areas like this and take that green and build it over as well. So I'll do that as a paint over here in just a second. And the only other area is that you just have the shadow shape kind of following the shape of the chin, and hers kind of dances up like this. So I think you have the cleft of her chin in the right spot. That feels pretty good. And then it just has a little bump. And then it dashes up before it comes back down. Yeah, I think actually even this can come in a little further. I'm looking at the shape, this negative space, so I have to remember your mouth is going to be there. So I'm looking at this space here. And sometimes switching your focus just to looking at like a negative space, so instead of looking at, like for example, concentrating on the shadow shape space, looking at the space here, or the space between areas, can help you see it a little bit more accurately. So I would work on bringing that over a little bit. My feeling is that where you, I think this is where you have your jawline. It's kind of hard to tell because these areas might be sunk in. But I'm going to assume that your jawline's right around in there, and that looks perfect. So let me go in and do the paint over part, and then we'll start talking a little bit about color. I think you have a really nice color here, especially for these underplanes. It works really nicely. So you can use that as kind of your main shadow color. But just remember that it gets a little darker as we go up, because this is the hair and her neck area and a little bit in the shirt is what's bouncing light into that lower jaw. So it's going to get a little darker towards the top. and along that core edge. And then you're going to want to take some of that greenish tint that you have, and you're going to need to retile a little bit along this edge to help rebuild that transition because you moved it in. And just remember, it does go kind of more purple, kind of mauve tone through the cheek as it transitions to that dark. So it's not so hot, and it gets a little darker as it comes over to meet that shadow. It feels almost counterintuitive to use a cool color there, but when it reads together with the other pink and even the warmer pink that you have, it'll read as more pink than the rest of the face. So don't worry about that. So something along that line. So I'll just show you what that looks like. Yeah, okay, so if your color's wet, definitely wait until it dries to do this. I don't know if you live in a warm climate or if it's cool where you live, but if you want to speed up the drying of your painting, and especially if it kind of has been kind of cool lately, try sticking your painting in a warmer room of the house while it dries, or I like to bake my paintings in the car because it gets really warm where I am. So I'll just set my painting in the car and let it heat up, and it'll dry your painting a little faster, especially if you're like feeling like you want to move forward and it's not drying quick enough. But definitely wait for it to be touch dry, not tacky anymore, before you move forward and try to repaint this area, because you will get mud otherwise and it'll be a little frustrating. So yeah, you can see how that strengthens the kind of bony structure and feeling in the face. Let's go into the nose a little bit and I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to take that line all the way there. So if you take similar colors and maybe warm up those shadows, I can't tell if they're just sunk in here, but I would definitely go in with that warmer brown for that deeper shadow, especially right up in the eye socket, because light usually hits in here and kind of bounces into that shadow, so it's going to pick up a little more warmth. And then you could either glaze this with the shadow color to knock it back, or you could mix a specific color for that area. But you can see how that kind of knocks that side and unifies that shadow. Oh, okay. So Stella, that's actually a good tip. Just a warning though, everyone, do not bake your painting in your oven. Partly because your paintings are somewhat flammable, but also it can actually, depending on the ground that you work on, it might lift and cause some issues. You don't want to risk that. But what Stella's saying, just with the light on, where it kind of slowly warms up the environment, that's perfectly fine. In fact, if you wanted to, you could take your painting and just put a regular light bulb, the kind that puts off just a little bit of warmth, just like your standard, not non-CFL, non-fluorescent light bulb, and you can just put it somewhat close proximity in a lamp or whatever pointed at your painting, and that slow warmth will help speed up the drying. Well, so Brenda, to answer your question, should you start with the nose and eyes? Yes, actually, since you said your shadow side is kind of wet, give that a few more days to dry and go ahead and work on the eyes. And I'll give you some pointers for those here in just a second. So, and the nose. So you can start with that shadow on the nose here. I think the colors you have in the nose are really nice, though maybe you need another kind of halftone somewhere, transitioning out of the shadow. You have a nice blue tone here. I'm thinking more in the tip of the nose, maybe something. And then don't be afraid to kind of warm up a little, maybe a little more surrounding where that highlight will be. Sometimes even adding just a touch of pink along that far side edge, and then finding where the broken light kind of comes in can help. I actually retiled my nose along this edge as well to help me control some of the values, but that way you can actually suggest the edge of the nose, but it's not a real hard line, and you can go through and kind of scumble over it and push that back, push and pull between the two as you develop each layer. Sometimes you might overshoot the mark in one layer and then you kind of tone it back in another. That's one of the benefits to working this in this way. I think the color that you have right here is really pretty, and I think I would like to see a little bit of that maybe in the transition for the eyebrows, and maybe a little bit in, I'm seeing that kind of lavender color right in here, in that keystone shape kind of in this area, and maybe a little bit underneath this plane goes just a little bit rosier and deeper. I think I warmed mine up too because I wanted it to feel like a little bit more of an underplane like what we have over here on the right. So I think as you go into the eyes, try pushing that value a little bit. You don't want it really dark. It's almost the value that you see on this side of the brow bone as it pushes over towards the shadow. Your eyelids might be a little bit on the pink side, so just as you kind of move forward, just take more of like a neutral skin tone or even a slightly cool one and use that to bring a little more light into the eyelid, especially because those eyelids are going to get obscured by the eyelashes. And you'll see that too in this weekend's demo. Though you could probably push a little darker for the crease. So just maybe pump that contrast up a little bit. So let me do a few changes to the eyes here, like what I was mentioning earlier. So rounding that out and then centering your pupil a little bit. So it doesn't look like you've introduced a little bit more of the green, so you might consider that. Let me just grab a black here. So just a general kind of bit of advice for pupils, because I had a couple people asking this morning. It's really important with the pupils to make sure you find an area where the edge gets lost. So if you look in here, she has this green and it comes up and then it just gets really dark. And it gets, but it's still kind of perceptible. You know, we can still see a separation between the pupil and the iris, but it's very subtle. So just as you get up into this area, and I look at those high-res pictures I provided this week, and you'll see more of that detail in my painting as well. I think you can mix more of like an olive green for her eyes too. But it kind of just fades, but it helps us lose that edge almost at the top of the pupil, and then we see it more at the bottom. And it gets slightly darker just before that highlight again. So kind of looking at those areas. And then, of course, the reflected light is always opposite of the highlight. And so you'll get this little illumination on that side. I realize working in this area is kind of tough because one little change to the iris or the pupil and she looks like she's looking in a different direction. So just spend as much time as needed to get those shapes to look good. And I made her pupil a little bit smaller in my painting than it appears in the photo. You're welcome to do that as well. That just kind of depends on what you want for your painting. And don't forget that in this inner corner, look at how dark and kind of warm that shadow gets on this inner white of the eye. It's not white, very white at all. You could probably bring it up a little bit in value, but I feel like maybe it needs to just be a little darker. It's going to add more dimension to that eye. And same goes for the whites of the eyes. If maybe you could cool it off. I can't tell if it's just the picture appearing warm, but make sure that they feel more bluish gray than they feel, rather than feeling kind of warm. So have that cast shadow there. A little bit maybe more gray, just subtly towards the bottom. So that it gradates down. But you can see how that adds some dimension to the eye. Just adding more of that shadow. Oftentimes we're scared to put a dark color on the whites of the eyes because we know they're white. You know, we think of them quite literal. And but if you look on this side, look how dark that value is right in there. And I think I might have lightened mine a little bit from the reference, just so it didn't get completely obscured. But you could start to go darker, and it'll make more sense once you get this eye blocked in, similar to the left one. So it might be easier for you to start with the irises and the pupils and get those kind of shaped, and then go in and adjust the whites of the eyes. It'll be less scary that way to approach. So looking at areas when you go into the pupil, or sorry, into the tear duct here, don't be afraid to push maybe more of a rich red for that underplane that we can see. I really like the alizarin with the red oxide mixture for something like that. It just happens to work really, really nicely. It's dark, but it's rich, and it adds a lot of luminosity to the eye. And you might find there's an area that has maybe a little more orange reflection. I know that happens on this inner part of the eye, and you might have a little hint of that, you know, through one section. But make sure you get that under shelf to that eye blocked in, because then afterwards you'll see in this lesson here, we go in and we put in, you know, some of the eyelashes above that. Hard to do it digitally without it looking funny, but essentially that lash line goes above that, and then it helps that feel illuminated. Okay, so let me pull up this again. I'm looking at some of the shapes here. Her chin might be a little large, but I feel like maybe it's just too light everywhere. Maybe you just need to push some of the forms, like you have these forms in here that help to break up that shape. So maybe you can start to build some more halftone around the chin. And make sure it's not as bright as what you have in other parts of the face. And I'm actually thinking maybe this can come up just a hint. And there's that subtle overlap here that happens. And maybe there's needs to be a little more shadow that pulls over. Not shortening the jaw too much, but just showing maybe more of that overlap very subtly. You have really nice colors though transitioning out of it, so try to not touch those. I know it's a tight space, but I think that'll help too with some of the likeness. You could also indicate the highlight on the eye, but don't feel like you have to commit to it if you're hesitant. I would recommend getting this part to read first and then wait for a second layer to add, the highlights. Since you are just kind of building into that second layer on the eyes. This part of her eye might be closing off too soon, just slightly. Looking at the shape here. Try bringing that grade down a little bit on this outer edge. And then right through the middle here, we don't see as much of that inner rim, so kind of narrow it here a little bit. Like bring that line up so we see less of that inner rim. We see more of it over here on the left side. And then with the right eye, don't be afraid to push your values a little bit more, like especially for the darks. You can see she has a nice dark shadow that starts off here, and it actually even comes up over the eye a little bit here. So I think when you go into the eyes on this side, you might consider putting in the dark for the lid first, and then you won't feel as hesitant to make the white of the eye a little bit darker, kind of as a result. And then the same thing for the colors of the iris and the pupil. Those will go darker. What helps her eye stand out on this side from the white of the eye is that she has a little of that illumination, and then it gets darker on this left side. So you can see how that's starting to work together. And then you can end up pushing that white of the eye to their appropriate value. Okay, so those are my main suggestions. Do you have any questions? So I would just say start with the eyes, finish the eyes, nose, maybe make the corrections to the position of the mouth. I'll send you this line drawing over the paint over so that you can see where to shift that. And then I would go in, once you know that the side of the face here is dry enough, and move that shadow shape over. I'll probably send you this without the paint over and then with the paint over, just so you can see where your changes are that need to be made. All right, well, if you have any questions, just let me know, Brenda. Good job. Really lovely colors. I actually don't have too many suggestions for your colors, other than just starting to refine, the transitions, so that things like this don't jump so quickly, but kind of keeping in the same color zones that you're working. They look really nice. Okay, Tammy. Are you in here, Tammy? All right. Well, if you are, just say hello and let me know if your painting feels off from, or the photo feels off from how it feels in real life. The only thing I'm kind of sensing is that the brightness is maybe a little high. That probably feels a little bit more like this. Brenda, don't worry about that too much. Just take one thing at a time. You're very, very welcome. Okay, so does that feel a little better, Tammy? In terms of lightness for your painting? I think the colors look great. Okay, good. All right, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about, and if you have any questions, just type them in and I'll address those specifically. But I'm going to go ahead and just start talking about a couple of changes. There's something that feels a little off in the eyes. So let's try to give you some drawing corrections for those. What it is that this eye here is feeling like, let me get my pen here. This eye looks down and this one's looking up. And so I feel like this one is pretty correct and this one is going to be a fairly easy fix. So let's concentrate on that right eye here. Her left, our right. So I just wanted to zoom in a little bit so I can see a little better. Okay, so with the shape here, I'm thinking, yeah, the color is different in the eyes too. I'm thinking that the reason this eye feels like it's looking down is partly that this angles down so quickly, but it also has to do with position of the iris. Hold on, let me do something real quick. I'm going to crop out some of that background so I can get the heads very close together. Look at that, your background's almost a perfect match. Okay, so yeah, it's a really subtle difference. So let's do some drawing here real quick. So I think in the beginning, where the eye starts off, maybe you could give her a little more fullness there. And then I think the corner of her eye probably doesn't dip down maybe as much. It looks like yours is sitting down here. I think where you have the eye starting is fine. I'm just kind of feeling this out here. But maybe this can open up just a touch. Make my line a little thinner so that you can see it more precisely. And that's going to, part of that's going to be, so I think actually where you have it starting seems pretty good, although this part kind of has more of like a dip in it. But you do have a nice kind of underplane color there, so make sure you maintain that underplane. Maybe it's that this dips down too quickly, so maybe flatten that out a little bit. And that also means kind of bringing that line up a little higher. And then I think the rest of it has to do with position of the iris and pupil. So I think making it more rounded and open at the top and then bringing your pupil up. Let me zoom out and make sure that's working. Yeah, like when we have eyes that are kind of looking up, you know, the iris kind of continues past, probably not that much, but it continues past what we can see, and then the pupil usually gets cut off a little bit. Now we do see most of her pupil in this, but it gets kind of lost in that shadow shape. I think her pupil is something like that. But you can see how it's up towards the top a little bit. Yeah, the dark line on the bottom here is what's kind of making that droop too. It's like almost this point, that little corner right there. So if you just kind of flatten out this bottom plane a little bit more and bring your shadow up maybe a little more gently and not have that sudden dip. I do see what you were trying to capture, which is that we see pretty much like this shape. Let me see if I can get that drawn in for you a little bit better. So I think where you have this is fine. Maybe it just needs to be more rounded and subtle like that. Where you have that underplane seems good. So that should help. I think a lot of it has to do with that positioning of the iris and the pupil. And that's going to get the two eyes to kind of read together. They're both now looking in the same direction. Whether or not you decide to keep the pupils really large, if you're going to keep it around what I kind of feel, I kind of sense here, even that out on this bottom half. Just bring this blue color up. And I think you could probably add a little more contrast to her eyes, especially because she has this darker ring around her hazel eyes. So you can start to hint at that, and that's going to help get her eyes to stand out a little bit more. On this right eye here too, I would give maybe a touch more fullness to the lid shape. So bring up your light tone just a little bit. Especially because you will be bringing this one up a bit. So let's go into some of the paint over here. Okay. Oh, you know what's also making the eye droop a little bit is this eyebrow shape. You have this point here kind of pushing down. So my feeling is that maybe this can flatten out just a touch, and then you're going to bring this up. And you might need to lift this out just a little bit more, because her eyebrow kind of comes out at an angle. It doesn't dip down so quickly. even though it's quite thick, and it kind of rounds out the feeling of it. So that's helping to kind of keep the eye from drooping too. Well, I think you would actually probably have noticed the eyebrow once you'd corrected the eye and some of those things. It's very subtle, a subtle difference. And as a result, you can see that like you've probably angled this shadow, kind of mimicking that, whereas it kind of comes a little bit more straight across. This area I realize is kind of complex. There's a couple of things happening. So we actually have the shadow wrapping in, starting to, and then you can carry this shadow up a little bit more. And then there's a slight light passage that kind of, but it's a real dark one that carries through. So I think you probably have something close, but you just need to adjust that shadow shape that's kind of creeping in right in this area here. Bringing that up is going to help. And you can take some of that deep shadow color, maybe warm up the shadow. I can't tell if it's just sunk in for the picture, but you might try making sure this has plenty of warmth to it. You want maybe a little more red, and that it slowly transitions across the eye there, and that you have a little more of a half tone right in here, and more of a connection to that shadow shape, or to that eyebrow. It's kind of a tricky area, because if you go too dark right in here, it can look a little harsh and Neanderthal-like for her. But if you don't have any shift in value leading into the keystone shape, then it feels very flat. So play with that just a little bit. Maybe even pulling in some pinks can help, just to have more of a mid-tone across that keystone, to build a little more dimension into that bridge of the nose. So it probably wasn't sunk in. You'd be surprised though, sometimes, especially burnt sienna has a tendency to do that if it's slightly dry. Like I'll come in the very next day and the paint's still tacky, but it looks a little more matte. You can always oil that out, and if it feels real nice, rich and red, then you leave it. If not, then try bringing a little more warmth in there. Some of the shape in the nose could probably be a little more rounded on this end here. The way her nose kind of softens out. Maybe just a few more halftones. And then that shadow color should continue down into that cast shadow where it's real warm. That nostril ring might have drooped a little bit too because of the eye. So maybe when you go in and readdress the shadow on the nose, make sure you bring that, keep it dark, but bring it up. Give it a little bit of a lift on the right side. And you might find yourself having to rework some of the nose shape. I think your nostril on this side feels pretty good, though it needs to be more in that red chromatic color. So, and I didn't add that in really. I had a little bit of it, but I didn't really emphasize it until I was able to go in with my second layer, which you haven't done yet. So I'm just giving you some pointers and things to think about when you move into that stage. And just, I pointed this out to a few of you earlier. Make sure that when you put in your cast shadow, it does have a slightly sharper edge, but make sure that it has a little bit of a soft edge, especially towards the tail end of it. It's a little sharper at the root where it first branches off from the nose, but it should get a little bit softer as it gets further from the nose, and it's going to give you a little more of a natural edge to that. Let's see, and then in the mouth, same thing. If your color's got maybe a little bit gray, so when you go into the lips, I think the first thing you'll want to do is go for that rich chromatic red that's for the shadow on her lip. I realize it's very subtle, but she does have kind of two values here. We have this shadow, and it gets a little darker as it comes down to this corner, so, but I'm just going to outline her shadow shape. Okay, and then this is light mass, mid-tone, and then light mass. So I think to make that just a little more clear in your painting will help. And don't be afraid to go for those rich chromatic reds in those shadows, especially in places like the mouth. And if any white gets kind of mixed in with any of your grays, or you get too pale, it can lose that richness of the chroma. So just make sure you're going dark enough in this area. And that's going to help balance out some of the contrast. Okay, so I think I'm going to leave that at this for now, since you need to concentrate on the features anyway. So let's go ahead and leave it at that. And then if you have questions midweek, if you want to go back out into this area, you can just email me and I'll send you a few suggestions. I think the colors and your transition across here is really lovely. So you're in the right direction. I would just concentrate on bringing those features up and getting the drawing corrections made. Do you have any questions, Tammy? Maybe that dips down just a little too quickly. Yes, I would. Usually whenever I go back into a painting, I correct whatever I see needs the most change, and that would definitely be the eye. The nose is, you're not really doing much drawing change except maybe the just clarifying the nostril and opening up the shape a little bit. The main one is that eye and this section right here, including the little shadow there. That's going to be the biggest change. So I would do that before anything else, definitely. And then you can kind of move on to the, I would do the right eye first and then move on to the left eye and then do the nose and the mouth after. Because we relate the mouth directly, everything kind of relates back to the eyes when we're looking at a portrait. So it's really important to get those eyes correct before anything else. All right, good work. Really nice colors. If you have any follow-up questions, just let me know. All right, Penny. I saw you in here earlier. Oh, and I wanted to tell everyone, next week, when you submit your homework, whatever stage it's at, send me, if you're mostly, oh, excuse me, if you guys are mostly all doing, I think everyone's pretty much still focused on the face, so if you can, send me a close-up kind of like this. It usually captures a little more accurate color than when you're kind of zoomed out. But you can send me one of each, but send me the close-up one too, because I can see a little bit more going on with your paint strokes and your edges and that sort of thing. And the images just hold up a little better. So make sure you get like a close-up shot as well. That'll help me out a lot. Okay, so Penny, I just wanted to ask you really quickly if the picture looks a little bit warm compared to your painting. Not compared to the photo, but compared to how your painting feels in real life. If it needs to go kind of more, maybe have a little less red in it, a little less yellow, just let me know. It's maybe a little bit warm. Okay, so I'm going to just take out just a little bit of the yellow and a little bit of the red. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump right in. You have really beautiful colors here. I think everything's working really nicely. I like the little like accents that you've placed, like the lavender tones. Now this angle on her, you do see some more of that because the light's in a slightly different position. Yeah, you have some nice tones under the eyes. Nose looks good. There's a few things that I think maybe could be pushed a little bit, and adjustments to some of the shapes. They're pretty minor, but I'll point some of those out here. So I think here in this section, her nose feels very broad and kind of straight. And she has just a little more of like a swing to her nose. So I think where most of that happens is up here near the keystone and bridge shape. So I think if you bring that shadow in just a little bit more and then tile in some more dark halftones, across the keystone here, kind of transitioning out of that. It doesn't quite carry down this far, just because this is like where the bridge comes, but that will help to indicate a little bit more of an overlap. And go in with a really warm color. And I almost feel like your color might be a little dark in here. So try taking maybe a little more red into the color. And I would even say, don't be afraid to illuminate it just a little more. It can make the color more interesting in that area if you have a little more of like a red-orange reflected light. Just in a few select areas. You can add a little more richness to a relatively dark shadow. And just don't forget to make sure you have a nice soft edge on that form. So that's already changed the feeling in her nose shape. And then you have that nice mid-tone, half-tone. It's like where it cools on the other side of the nose. Just use that to help you shape maybe a little more of a dip in here. Then she has this little bump that comes out for the ball of the nose. It's not real exaggerated, but I think it would help to shape her nose a little bit. And what also will help her nose feel less round on the end is to make sure you have that nice sharp peak to that shadow on the far side. It comes up quite high. Might even take some of that warm reflected color looks like you have actually a nice color in there already. And it kind of starts to wrap that corner just slightly. And you could probably just find an accent core shadow in here that slowly fades off. Bring it up a little higher. No, actually, it was better down low. Okay. And then accent there. It's a very warm color. And I see you have one, but maybe just push it a little bit more of a distinct contrast. One way to bring that nose out too is to maybe have, you almost don't see it real obvious, but if you enhanced it a little bit, it would read really well, is to bring a little more, just a touch more pink just before that shadow. Deepen it a little bit, up the chroma, especially right before that highlight. Sometimes it can just be done with a little glaze, but that helps to bring that nose forward a little bit more. Yeah, it is a challenge to keep a steady hand in those small areas. Do you have a maul stick? And to answer your question, Marianne, yes. So what's happening here, your question is the reason to have this warm color in here because there's light reflecting from the cheekbone, and that's exactly why. So what's happening is we have this light hitting here, and it's going to come and illuminate, but also it's hitting here. And if you think about that, it's going to illuminate in there as well. I'll draw that with white. So you have the light hitting here, and it's going to illuminate that slight fold a little bit more as well. Okay, well, yeah, you can use your forearm or a maul stick, but I almost always require one in these refining stages because it's just too hard to steady your hand so much. Just a note with the nostril on this side, I think you could probably make it a little taller because of the foreshortening. Maybe give it a little more of a point there at the top, and then just make this a little more subtle where it transitions into these midtones. You could do that just with a simple glaze of the darker brown, just kind of like a unifying, a unifying glaze that will help to bring that edge a little bit more nuanced so it doesn't pull our eye too much. Okay, so apart from the nose, that's just to help you lock in a little more likeness. And it gives you that more of that lift. You see that? Where it looks like we're looking underneath her nose a little bit more. Helps with that perspective. Let's look into the eyes here. Oops. I wanted to move the reference a little closer so I can look at the shape here. All right, so my feeling is that the inner corners might be pushing up too much. So I'm going to just draw in where I think it can move a little bit. I do see that slight angle here, but I think the tear duct is maybe just a little bit lower, and it's very obscured in the picture because she has a little bit of light coming in on it. but even this angle is probably a little exaggerated. So I would, maybe it's that this needs to come up just ever so slightly, and then this needs to level down, and then just think of this as the corner of her tear duct. And maybe make this value right inside a slightly darker pink than the highlight that kind of wraps around that inner corner. That should fix that eye. I think it's mostly this here that needs to level out a little bit. Leave this corner and this outer half where it is. It's just kind of from here to here that needs the most work. And then with this eye, I think this angle here comes up too quick. This one. So I would, it needs to continue straight for a little bit. Let me do this in black so it's a little easier to see. Round that out just a little bit. I think something like that. I'm just going to redo that. I think where you have this starting to come up actually is okay. It's just this inner part. So maybe just round out the pupil on that bottom half. That should do the trick. And then where the light cuts off here, because of this cast shadow, is a little lower. So even if you don't want to completely obscure that later half, make it maybe a deeper red, so it feels like it falls into shadow even though we can still see that inner rim. But don't be afraid to have that obscured, and you can start to indicate a little bit of that cast shadow. If you don't want to make it like razor sharp, which I wouldn't recommend, you can still kind of let it taper off and just give it a softer edge. And then push this color a little bit lower on that far side. And maybe this color is too bright for that area. It's cooler and it's a slightly darker value right as this starts to wrap back and disappear behind the cheek there. And you can bring more red into that forefront of that eye. It gets lighter pink towards the tear duct, but add a little bit more richness to that color. I'm just looking at the differences here. Okay, do you have any questions? Oh, that you just typed one. Is her right side of the cheek too wide? Slightly. I think it has to do with actually this section here. Let me first draw in with a line where I think I see it. So this part, yeah, I think it'll be something like that. And I think it would help. I can't tell if it's the picture, but if you went ahead and even took some of that warm color and built some reflection. Now her shirt is actually reflecting more of a green in this lower half. but you could do it a little warmer if you wanted. But as it comes up, I would maybe favor some of that warmer kind of chocolate color, just to add a little more richness to that shadow. But it would help to differentiate the side of the jaw from the neck. I'll leave this sketch here because that's kind of what I'm seeing. Maybe this here. Let me get rid of that line there. A little bit of that shadow edge. It gets a little darker. You have to remember this form is wrapping back towards the shadow, regardless of whether you see a shadow there. If you were on this side of her, on the right side of her, you would see that shadow continuing back. And make maybe this area just a little bit less contrasted. And that will help too. But yeah, I think that the temple area started off too wide, and then it made the whole cheek feel too wide. So it's mostly at that highest point. And then defining maybe some reflected light in this area down below, right in here. That will help to I don't think you need to widen your shadow. I painted it in a little wide, but just go in with that reflected light. That's going to make a big difference to the whole feeling of the face too. And if you're having trouble seeing the neck area, what you might do is take the photo and lighten it further just so you can see drawing-wise where it is and kind of sketch it in using your reflected light color, because it's easy to go dark again if you needed to with the hair. So try sketching in where that is. And you can leave a lot of this obscure in this area here. Like right in here. That's fine. You don't have to go as light as what it is there. So long as you have some definition along that underplane. So those are the areas I would like you to concentrate on this week. The nose, refining that shape, correcting the eyes, and that side plane of the cheek, getting that shape a little closer. I think it'll lock in her likeness, and then we can start to tweak a little bit in the lips and the larger planes of the face, but it's mostly there. Any other questions? I'll make sure I have, let me clean that up a little bit. Oops. I wanted to clean up this line. I'll put in a real obvious line for you to kind of follow here. And maybe it'll help you sketch it in. I mean, her neck comes back in here, but this is kind of, it reads a little better to have that dark kind of fall in there. And that way, when it's off, you can kind of see where things need to push in. Yeah, the little changes, they really do add up. So I'll make sure I send you the one with and without the line drawings so that you can see it without and then see it with it. You're very, very welcome. It's looking great. And thanks for sending that close-up shot. That really helps. All right. Alexandra, are you in here? All right, so I just feel like the painting picture looks a little warm. So if you're in here, leave a comment and let me know. My feeling is that maybe it has a little too much yellow in the photo, not in the painting. I can tell because I'm looking at like where the glare is and the highlights. So that's probably okay right there. Okay, so I can't tell if this is the true color of your shadow on the face, but it's a little too saturated of a red. So I would suggest maybe mixing more of a red brown. So taking this color, but making, you can see it's kind of pinkish, making it a little bit more maybe that's too orange. Making it maybe a little more like this color here. Maybe a little darker. So you can see it's just a little bit more muted. So if you take this color that you maybe have mixed for the shadow, add a little bit of ochre to it and a touch of blue. And that should give you a little bit more of that neutral brown. And that will suit the portrait a little bit more. Because wherever you put those really intense reds, you're going to want to do that with quite a bit of purpose. And then she has these cool transitions. This one kind of comes out as like a purplish color because of the red in the cheek. And then down below, it's more of a gray and kind of a grayish green. Moves away from the red. So I would maybe push that a little bit darker right next to the shadow. And it might look a little jarring next to this really strong red at first until you tone that down a little bit. Maybe introduce some of that darker hair color that you have. It's hard to find a spot because there's some glare there. But just bring it a little closer to neutral. And save those richer kind of red browns for areas like the underplane of the jawline. It actually gets kind of darker and cooler as it moves up and away. So I'm just trying to tone back some of that red to bring it a little closer to what it is in the picture here. Oops. So you can see that helps a lot. Your other colors look pretty good. I think, again, look for those areas where maybe you got a little warm, like right in here. It's very red-orange. And in her, it's a little bit more muted. So just to compare those colors, you can kind of see you're in the right value range. It just needs to be a little bit more gray. So you can take the color that you use there and maybe introduce a little blue and a touch of white. And that's just going to help enhance the warm areas and bring kind of balance to the portrait. And then her lights are quite cool as well. So you can start to tone some of those a little bit more gray. You actually have a really nice kind of tone right in here, that lavender color. That works really nicely. You want to watch some edges like you have right in here, right along that edge. You maybe want to take a little bit of a darker transition tone that's close to the blue-gray that you already have, and just tile a little bit in there. To round out that jawline and just give it a little more softness as it recedes. And the same goes just in general across the chin, though that area here was just standing out a little bit. And I think up in the forehead too, you can push some of the dark of that mid-tone as it transitions out from the shadow color. There's even a little bit of a green tint to it in areas. So there's a lot of complex forms in there, so make sure you're not getting too light too quick with your midtones. Here in the neck as well, start to bring it down a little bit in value. I know it feels really pale, but it's a little bit darker. And then these underplanes, you have the right kind of richness to the color, but maybe you want to go a little bit darker. This actually inner corner is perfectly fine, but on this outer corner, maybe go a little bit deeper with that red for those underplanes to build up a little more contrast. And don't be afraid to push the whites of the eyes where you have the cast shadow, push it a little bit darker. Add some dimension to the whites of the eyes. You actually seem to have it plenty dark on that left side. That looks pretty good. And then around the eyes, just start to look for, when you see me in the next video adding some of these cooler accents and some of the cooler grays, just start to look for where you can bring in some more of those around this section. There's even like this gray, kind of blue that pulls it down and starts to accent some of those areas. All right, so those are my suggestions. If you have any questions, you can write in the forum with a follow-up, and I look forward to seeing the next stage. All right, Colin, are you in here? I know you said you were going to try and catch maybe the tail end of it. If you are, say hello. Yeah, this is looking really nice. I know you had made quite a few changes from the previous session. You have a really nice likeness here. I think what I'd like to see is just focusing on maybe more of these very nuanced transitions, especially like in this picture in particular. this angle, you see this gray pick up in her skin really, really clearly. And it gets real dark, that rounding down of the form here at the bottom, very gradual. It gets so cool in this area. It's almost like straight gray. You see that color kind of pull in a little bit in through here. Now we don't want to over accentuate that because it's going to kind of make her jowl area feel a little heavy. But she does have more gray through the muzzle area. They're just varying values of that gray. Some areas have maybe a little more pink to them. I do feel like this is maybe dropped a little bit too low. So maybe play with that shape a little bit. I might have accentuated that a little too much, but that might help with that heaviness feeling that we were sensing in the lower jaw as well. Her chin is probably a little bright as well, and so if you start to incorporate some of these halftones and push this area down a little bit in value, it will help this jawline not feel maybe so heavy. She does have, you know, some highlight here, but it doesn't necessarily reach the intensity of the highlights in the upper portion. And then as this starts to pull away, don't be afraid to push that a little bit deeper as it rounds, partly as it rounds towards the shadow. And also as it rounds towards these areas. And these can go kind of more of a cool gray before they hit that shadow edge. And I think her shadow could go darker, even if you don't want to go as dark as it is in the picture. Maybe go at least something like that, and then you'll push the hair behind even darker. And that's going to give you, so rather than making the reflected lights on her jawline lighter, which is starting to make your shadow shape get a little lost, push the hair darker, and it'll make that, by contrast, make that reflected light feel brighter, and you can go a little darker with it. Maybe pick out a deeper mauve tone too to help you transition this shadow edge here into that pink. I would say that's my primary suggestion, and then go into the eyes and start to build a little more contrast in the color of her eye. She does have somewhat pale green eyes, but they're a little bit darker than what you've painted in. And at the very least, make them a little darker around that outer ring. But I think that will help to build some of that contrast, and don't be afraid to go maybe a little darker with your pupils and move away from the brown color. And you might feel like you can go a little darker with the irises once you put in the pupils a little bit darker and get more of that contrast. Okay, so those are my suggestions, Colin. So if you have any questions as you work on these, the main one is these transitions here in the jaw and on that far side of the face. And then you can go back into the features and begin refining some of those steps as well. But if you have any questions, just post in the forum. And, oh, Colin just arrived. Is that you? It's coming up as Annie. I just want to make sure. No, don't worry about it. It's okay. Were you able to catch the whole thing? Your whole segment? Because you might have to scrub back and rewatch the earlier part. I'll recap for you really quickly here. Oops, let me get my ink pen. So okay, so the main thing that I saw here was that she has, in this picture it's really obvious, she has this very kind of cool tone there right in this area, and I think you can push that a little more, and that's going to help enhance all of these nice warm areas that you have in her skin tone. And then my other suggestion was to make sure you don't get too light with your core shadow or your main shadow on the form of the face, and that instead of making it lighter and trying to capture that reflected light that way, try going darker with the hair behind. And that way you can continue to push some of these darker, cool mid-tones, kind of transitioning out, and it's going to help this side feel brighter by contrast. But you'll still have that nice defined kind of reflected light feeling if you go darker with the hair. Does that make sense? So you can see the subtle difference there in the tonality, and how pushing those grays a little bit more is going to not only push the form, you know, of that light, that fall off of light, but it also helps to enhance, you know, those nice warm areas. And my other suggestion is that you might want to go in with your real dark black for the pupil now, because it still feels kind of like a brown, and then you'll probably feel like you can go a little darker with the eyes as a result, because they are just a touch too pale. She does have that real pale kind of green, and maybe the whites of the eyes could go a little darker as a result too, but I think pushing that contrast in the pupils is going to help too. All right, do you have any questions, Colin? Oh, I see one. One question, the nose on the left, should it be a little wider? Let me check. I see. You know, it's really close. It probably could come out by like that much. What I do feel is that the tear duct needs to come out. Let me grab a dark color. Maybe just a little bit more. I realize it's obscured a bit, but just maybe have a slight color differentiation between, you know, where the light spills over this little membrane, and that will help to bring, you know, these to feel closer together as well. But yeah, the nose, maybe it's not by very much. you could maybe bring this back a little and then just have a slight value shift between here and here. And it can be very subtle because it is in the picture. It's barely noticeable. Yeah, but it's looking really nice. You have a great likeness. So I think just pushing some of those colors, and we'll continue developing week by week. And since you're tuning in a little bit later, I just wanted to repeat what I'd said earlier at the start. Kind of in the weeks following for critique, just continue, you know, progressing. Not everyone's going to be at the same stage. Some people are still finishing their the second color block in. But this weekend's lesson is on the third and final color pass, detail pass on the portrait. But if you can't get that done by next weekend, don't push yourself. Just continue working on that second color pass and making some of these corrections. I did put up a video on that might help using an app that on your phone, if you're taking pictures with your phone, that can help you capture a better quality picture. And also in the forum I posted, because I think it was Linda had said she couldn't find an Android version because I was working with my iPhone. But I found a Google Play kind of Android equivalent that's very similar to the Pro Camera that I use, the app. So if you use an Android and you want to try that other app, I posted the link to that in the forum. So just letting you know. Alrighty, good work. It's looking really nice. I look forward to seeing it next week. And if you have questions about this, just let me know. And you should be able to scrub back. I don't know if you can do that now or if you can do that later. While this is live, I'm not really sure. But you can. I'll post the link to this video in the forum once we're finished here. You're very welcome. Glad you could make it just at the tail end. All right, Stella, you are up. And I know you had said you haven't quite glazed the hair yet. You don't have to worry about that because I have a lesson coming next weekend on painting hair. So maybe wait to glaze the hair until you watch that lesson, because I'll show you a couple of tricks for getting these really fine strands and details in the hair. So that's coming next weekend. So let me check and see that close-up, because it might help a little bit. Give me just 1 second. Yeah, okay, I'm going to go ahead and pull that up. Give me just 1 minute. I'm going to open up my email. All right, here we go. Yeah, that's going to help, I think, because I'm going to concentrate mostly on the face. Okay. All right, so this is looking really nice. I think there's a few things that you were saying something about your color. It feels very yellow in the picture, so let me adjust that really quick. Would you say it's more towards pink in your portrait in real life? She has very, very pink flesh tones. Is that closer? Okay. Is it too green, or does that look good to you? Does that look pretty close to how it feels in real life? A little bit pinker? That could be, let's see, maybe push that, take away some of the green. Okay, we'll work with that. All right, so let's see. If you have any specific questions, Stella, go ahead and type them in. And I'm going to start just going over a couple of things. Now, you're right. When you go in and you glaze the color of the hair, it's going to make a pretty big difference. But you might want to wait to do that until we go in, but I'll just show you. It's going to kind of pick up some of that richness, you know, so just comparing her skin tones to that chromatic kind of red hair is going to make a difference. But you don't need to do that just yet. I have a video on hair, which I think would be helpful because she has this really fine texture that'll be really nice, and you might want to utilize the way I paint, which is I apply a glaze and then I'll paint wet and wet into that glaze. So that's something you could potentially do since you have a lot of the major forms of the hair. You could use the second pass over the hair as a refining stage and glaze that red oxide in there, and that's going to give you almost that exact color. It'll be really close to it anyway. Yeah, I'm just going to leave that there so I can kind of get a feeling for how the colors are going to play. I'm just going to leave that loosely in there. Okay, so you do have some of those really nice pinks. Areas where I think you can bump the chroma that will help include like right here under the nose. You can see that really rich red on the other side of that nostril. And maybe going in maybe with a little more of a deep, it's going to look a little jarring at first. But building up some of that chroma there, it's going to give that sense of kind of translucency. And then she has a little bit more of a, I would say a warmer pink that starts to pick up in the nose here. Pick up a little darker color. So there's that rosiness. So I think you could punch up that chroma in some of these areas with maybe more of a peachy tone since you have so much cool pink kind of all around. Maybe introduce a little of the cadmium red into those areas, especially where like this form starts to turn. That's going to be more of a chromatic kind of peach tone. Right there at the top of the bridge. And you start to build up some of those smaller forms too that help shape her unique shape to her nose. It's probably hard to and tempting to go in and start painting some of those freckles, but you might want to wait until that final detail layer, and I would really say to do it very gradually. Kind of squint your eyes and look at the areas that are most obvious. And one of the ways you can actually create that illusion is when you're going in and refining some of the forms. You can basically kind of stipple, and instead of blending perfect smooth transitions, you kind of leave them more like a broken edge. And I showed you how to do that for like capillaries and creating a little vibrancy in the skin tones that way in my portrait. So you can use the similar technique. What you want to avoid is going through and doing polka dots, you know, a few maybe that stand out, you know, but a lot of it's going to be kind of irregularity in the pigmentation. And I always think less is more. So here in the nose, you can carry maybe a little bit of that light down, but don't forget to have that connection across the bridge, that keystone. You have a really nice violet there in the keystone shape, so maybe throw in a little bit of a peachy tone, because it does tend to pick up a little more in. It picks up almost a little bit of her hair color there. It almost looks like it's reflecting some of that. And it gets really warm right before that shadow, so you might pick up the chroma, go dark with it, maybe a little darker than what I did. But that's going to help to kind of get things to pop there. You'll notice a few areas, like in here, her shadow gets very red because the hair right in this area is kind of illuminating that shadow, and then the shadow gets kind of red down towards the bottom, and yours feels maybe a little bit more, I can't tell if it's sunk in or not, but I think if you went in with a more chromatic, try using maybe try using a little cadmium red mixed into your shadow color. It'll lighten it, but it'll also bump that chroma, especially for those lovely reflected lights. And it gets a little more orangey towards the bottom, but then, so you would just take that cad red and add a touch of ochre. Because she doesn't have that much coloration in her lights, I think really bumping the chroma in the shadow is going to bring a lot of life to the painting. It's usually one or the other. You know, one area will have kind of a dominant richness. It even carries down here into the neck a little bit. There are those cool greens, but having that real rich and going real dark in here, pushing some of your contrast, is going to help her pop forward as well. Because I think you have really beautiful colors. You captured these colors really nicely. Look for real subtle areas, like right here you see how it just suddenly hits like a deeper rosy tone before it hits that green. Look for some areas where you can create some of that punch in color. And maybe add a little more of the rosiness around her lids. Especially redheads, they tend to have a little bit more of those red eyelids. You don't want her to look like she has swollen eyelids, of course, but maybe just punch up the warmth in some of these areas in the pink. Just like finding those subtle chromatic transitions will help add some life to those areas. I think even in the nose, if you look really closely, there's like this red, deeper red kind of halo going around that shadow, that darkest part, and that helps to kind of warm the transition, leaving it. And you could probably go push that a little darker. She has that cool green kind of reflected light up there, but if you get down into the nose, you see how it turns kind of a red reflected light, almost like what we have down here. So maybe on this side down here you go, well, let me push this a little darker first. For this dark you might use a little bit of red oxide and alizarin with your blue, and that'll give you a nice rich dark color. But then underneath that you have that red color, so it still feels like it's part of that shadow, but it's that reflected light, and any of the underplanes are going to pick up some of that. So you were saying you lost the eyes a little bit somehow. The one on the left is off. I think it has to do with where you place your dark lash line. So if you push this down, just make sure that that's nice and clear. Maybe indicate where, I'm just drawing it in a little bit more obvious. You'll notice that her eye is the whites of the eyes are actually quite dark, and that's what makes her green eyes pop. Doesn't mean you have to go really, really dark, but maybe dark and then maybe a little bit of a gray reflection in there. But don't be afraid to push that dark for her. And her eyelashes catch a little bit of light here, so I can see what you were starting to do there. And if you want to do that, you can as well. But yeah, I think just push that edge down. And maybe her upper lid got just a touch full. So you can see how that really helped her eye pop out a little bit more. And you probably are a little too light of a green there. Just make it gradually get darker towards the top, and that will kind of help. I realize it's a small area, and if you have to paint over your highlight, don't feel bad about doing that. Sometimes it's easier just to add those in at the end, rather than trying to paint the pupils around it. So I would just concentrate on making those a little bit more even, and clarifying some of the color, shape. Round this one out just a touch. It should get darker as it kind of creeps towards the top. And oftentimes the pupil gets lost in the shape towards the top. It depends. Let me look at her eyes. Yeah, you can see it kind of where it touches the lashes. It starts to lose some of its edge. And the highlight, or the illumination on the iris, is always opposite of the highlight. So if the light's coming down this direction, let me draw with the ink pen. So if the light's coming down in this direction, hits here, it's going to bounce through and illuminate the opposite side. So just pay attention to where that tends to fall dominant. Is one too big? One what? Which eye? One of the eyes? I think the left eye feels pretty good now that this line has been brought down. This one maybe feels a little bit squinted. So maybe this part needs to open up here. Oops, wrong color. Just trying to shape that a little bit. What will help too is going in with that tear duct color and separating that from the white of the eye. And maybe taking this and opening it up just a little bit. This might be a little big now. But maybe also her eye could widen a little bit on that outer corner. Because her crease kind of comes something like that. This eye might have closed off a little soon too. Maybe just flatten that bottom part out a little bit wider, where you have this little light kind of tracing over. That kind of opened up both of the eyes a little bit more. And they're kind of evening out. I think clarifying like your whites of the eyes and the space for the tear duct too, like make that a very distinct shape. And that will help the eyes feel the appropriate size too. Like that almost touches that shadow shape. That might be a little wide. And then your whites of the eye will carry over just a little bit. They're very subtle things, but yeah, go ahead and tweak both of the eyes a little bit. And I would say concentrate on that for this week, along with the nose and some of the chromatic, that shadow. And that's all I'm going to kind of give you for this week, because I don't want to overwhelm you. So I would work on those corrections for the eyes, work on this shadow, warming that up, and then adding those little chromatic pops of color in the nose. Do you have any questions? So yeah, you can see subtle difference, and look at what a difference that shadow color makes just by warming that up. And you don't have to do the hair glaze. I'll erase that so you're not thinking you have to do that. I just put that in for my own reference. You're welcome to do it if you want to just kind of color it so that you can make your color judgments a little easier, but alrighty. Good work, Stella. It's looking really nice. I think in the next critique we'll talk a little bit about the mouth and areas, and we could like enhance some of the colors, but I really think it's on its way, so I'll just give you those and we'll go from there. I'm glad to hear you're loving the class. That makes me happy. Okay, Marianne. Okay, you said you just sent me a close-up. Let me see. All right, let me send that over here. All right. You can see the difference in color here just from the two pictures. So I'm going to go ahead and work from this close-up, and because we're not really going to go into much more than just the face. But before we do that, Marianne, I'd like to just ask you which one feels a little closer in color, so I can adjust this one to your original painting and when you're standing in front of it. Is it a little bit more red and pink like the left picture, the larger one, or is it closer to the close-up shot? It's closer to the close-up shot. Okay, that's good to know. Is there anything you'd like me to change? The only thing I kind of sense is that it feels maybe a little bright in the mid-tones. Does that look a little better? It's slightly pinker than the close-up shot, so let me adjust that just a little bit. How's that look? All right, good. Okay, so let's go ahead and work with that one. All right, and if you have any specific questions, Marianne, go ahead and just post them in the comments there. And I'm going to go ahead and start pointing out a few things. I'm going to start with a couple of drawing corrections, and I'll do those as a line. Okay. All right, so the first thing that stands out to me, I think, is you have actually really beautiful colors happening. So I don't have that many suggestions. There's a few for the color, but for the most part, I feel like it has to do with the contrast that you're getting. So a matter of maybe pushing some of these areas to a little bit darker value, and we lost a little bit of the sense of this shadow shape that's very distinct on her face here. Even though it's not a real wide shadow shape, it does take up about that much space. And so we want to make sure we indicate some of that and find the strength in that, because the reason that helps, you know, she's looking a little bit younger. She looks like maybe like a 14-year-old version of our model. So you have some likeness there, but she's looking younger because you don't have as much angularity and in that bone structure. And when we tend to round things out, it makes them feel a little bit younger. So by adding that bone structure there and maybe bringing up the dark for that jawline through the chin, that's going to help quite a bit. The next thing I think is, oops, I didn't want that to disappear. Well, oh, there it goes. There's a feature on this program where if you double tap, it erases everything you just did. I think I need to go into my settings and make sure I turn that off. Okay, well, I'll do a paint over as well for you. I'm just drawing these out so that you can see very clearly when you go back in and paint where your lines are and where this should be. So it'll serve as a good guideline for you. So moving into the nose, for example, I think the shadow on the nose could be a little wider here. It kind of comes out like that. And then you do have the nostril, right? And then the cast shadow, that feels pretty good. But I feel like her nose maybe gets a little narrow here. I'm feeling that out here. I think it has to do with where this shadow comes over. Maybe something like that, and then you'll lower the nostril shape. It's kind of like that there. Maybe this needs to come down a little bit. She has quite a bit of space here, so maybe the nose got a little bit short as well. Yeah, that feels better. Okay, so that's just some of the drawing position. Yeah, you know, Marianne, you said you always fail to get shadows dark enough. It's okay. We all have a tendency towards one thing or another. Some people go too dark too soon. Some people have a hard time pushing those values. So that's what we'll concentrate on with this, is getting those nice contrasts. Because you have actually really beautiful light tones. And even some of your transitions here are working pretty well. The only problem is once we go darker here, we might have to rework some of these edges along that shadow to get a little more contrast. But what it will help is to make these feel more vibrant, because we're going to be pushing darker as it moves across the form. Okay, so that's just a little bit, it's a tiny tweak to the nose, but I think making sure you get wide enough with that shadow and dropping that down and opening up the nostril, it's going to give us more of that underplane point of view. And then with the mouth here, I think the edge, the corner of the mouth should line up with her iris. So maybe you could extend that just a little bit further, and it'll also go a little lower. And then make sure she's facing this direction. So the curve, the slight angle is going to be kind of like that. So you want to make sure the Cupid's bow dip in the lip is centered on kind of that angle. And then this corner of the mouth, there's the actual corner, and then she has this little shadow shape. That corner sits kind of in an ambiguous spot, but it should be maybe just a little wider is what I'm thinking. Maybe something like out here. So maybe try extending it just a little bit wider. And you can even see that triangle relationship to the nose. I'll check the eyes for you. So you think they feel too small. And then the philtrum. I think the feeling in the philtrum has to do with bringing a little light shape into here. That will help it feel like it straightens out a little bit. The eyes, let me take a look. I think what's happening is that this feels like it's closing off too quickly. And your ellipses for the eyes are going this direction when they should be maybe just a little more round. So let's try bringing this a little narrower. Keep that one where it is. We're going to round that down and then bring the lid just a little bit lower. And then this is going to drop to meet it. So instead of having the corner of her eye feel like it's high up there, we're going to bring that down. I think where you have your pupils looks fine. Maybe the tear duct little corner needs to come up. because it almost felt like it was down here. But it's a little hard to tell because the paint edges that you have are so soft. And don't forget to have at least a little bit of space for that underplane that we're seeing here, and I'll do that in the paint over. This is just for the sketching. This part of the eyelid is a little more compressed and then it opens up. So you could bring that line down just a little bit. And you can see how now it's starting to capture her shape. And the same goes for this eye here. Now, what you have is almost a feeling of her looking down at us, and maybe we need to have it straighten out and then bring the pupil up a little bit to make it so that she's looking a little bit more upward. So that's helping. So in this eye, very similar. I think you could probably make that a little bit more open. Though this eye looks much closer to how her eyes look. Make sure that pupil favors that upper half. And don't forget that nice underplane before the depth of the tear duct. So I think the more you reveal of that underplane too, the more it's going to feel like we're beneath her looking up. This feels okay though, where you have that bottom half. I think you just need to go in and define with more contrast the shapes of the lids and stuff. Okay, so those are for the drawing corrections. The color of the lips, it's a little bit too of a hot color. So let's go into the paint over stage. So just by comparison, you can see her pink on her lips is just a little bit more of a cool pink. So I would try going in with alizarin and some white and maybe a touch of blue, and try adding a little bit more of a cool tone over a majority of the lip. And then don't be afraid to push that contrast here into a deep kind of brick red. Oxide brown and alizarin for the upper lid edge. Yes, yes, that'll be a nice color. So I'll do that paint over here. So if you do, you can also use that similar color for this dark in the lip. And don't be afraid to push that a little bit darker underneath. So that same color is very similar to what I have on here right now. So you're going to use something like that for that underplane. And let's see. Her white of her eye goes into a really deep gray in this corner. So that's going to help to build some of that contrast. And she does have a little more of a cast shadow here. It's maybe a touch lighter. But the whites of her eyes are not really bright at all, and you can go in and start to build a little more dark. One of the things that's going to help make the pupil feel more convincing is to have the dark part of the upper iris start to disappear into shadow and kind of merge. What do you mean, Marianne? Contrast where for red? I was talking about in here in the lip, this real dark, shadowy value. But yeah, you can have that nice, soft green in her eyes, so long as you get darker towards the top where that cast shadow is coming across. It's going to add more dimension. And you don't even have to worry about painting in the highlights just yet. You can always add those back. It's almost better to not worry about trying to paint around those tiny highlights. Even though they're fun to put in this early. So you can see that's already adding a bit more dimension to the features. With the shadow, let me just show you what it would look like when you add a bit of that shadow back into the face here. Now, of course, you're going to want to go, you might find yourself needing to go back into the area behind her hair first, just so that you have that contrast, you don't lose that nice edge. And that might make you feel a little bit more confident about coming in here and building that nice rich brown. I'll go just a little bit warmer. There we go. Find a color that's kind of close to that burnt sienna red that we use. You're not going to use straight burnt sienna. You'll probably mix it with a little bit of blue and ochre, but go in with that nice rich dark. And don't be afraid to push that contrast. Now she does have some of that greenish tone to the underplane, so you can let that kind of mingle with the red and have some more of that olive tone underneath. But it goes considerably darker in some of these areas here. And then once you have that in, then you can start to pick up some of the contrast along the far edge. Because even though you don't see this wrapping around, you know, you're not on the other side of her, look at how much that softly rounds towards the dark. So it should be something even kind of purpley pink right in here. Then it kind of transitions into that rosy color. Right through there. As it comes down, it picks up more of like a neutral kind of green-gray. And it can feel really foreign if you're not used to using these colors, or you're not used to painting in higher contrast. It can feel really strange to jump in and suddenly be using these colors, but and a little scary perhaps to push your values that much. But it's going to build more dimension to your painting. I'll address your other question here in just a second. So just pay attention to some of these transitions. I think that's the major one. I mean, look at how dark it is in this underplane to the eye here. That just disappears into that shadow color. And she has a little more, you know, shadow under the eye, and then in this shape here. And of course, we talked about building a little more dark into that shape. So just kind of looking at how much drama that kind of adds to the portrait, and also how much it rounds out and makes this area feel so vibrant. So your question was, the brows need to darken to make her look older. She still looks, yeah. So you can start to gradually darken the eyebrows, like just where like the underplanes are. When you come in and add this shadow, you can use that shadow color to come in, and you just want to make sure that when you add the dark for the eyebrows that you have a transition tone kind of leading out of them, so that they don't feel like a hard kind of outline shape. So you might have like it's a skin tone, but maybe it's a little darker or more gray. You know, a couple of tiles that are real soft. That way it feels more natural. This whole socket is pretty dark compared to the one on the left side, and even the left side has maybe a little bit more contrast, or sorry, a little bit more, yeah, a little more contrast. Like here in the dark here, you can, that's one area where you tend to lose a little bit of that definition in the brow, is where it meets that underplane for the eye socket. Yeah. So if you feel like you're, you know, wanting to make a change, but you're afraid of losing some of the drawing, definitely go in with those darkest accents first, because that makes a huge difference. So go in with that deeper alizarin crimson, put in these dark shadow shapes like that one first. Then you can go in, and it won't be as scary to go in and make some of these more subtle gradients a little darker, like in the whites of the eyes, or even some of these transitions won't feel so scary so once you get that nice rich shadow into that side plane of the face. That's pretty much what I want you to concentrate on this week, is the eyes, making some of the drawing corrections to the eyes, but also concentrate on getting that nice dark value for that cheek. And even like I said, before you get the cheek in, you might find yourself needing to go in and darken the hair behind the face a little bit on this side of the head, just so that you have that contrast then to the cheek. And what often happens is if you don't go dark enough in one area, like in here, and we don't realize it until later, but if you didn't go dark enough here, then you're not going to go dark enough here, and it's going to kind of repeat across the form. So that's kind of what tends to happen. So don't worry if it's a lot of work. Just start with that shadow shape. That's the most important one. And of course, drawing corrections in the eyes. Yeah, well, describing, it is good to see them in action. That's, I guess, one of the benefits to doing this online, is oftentimes if you're in a physical class, you might not have a teacher who wants to touch your work, and you might not want them to touch your work because it's your painting too. So the nice thing is I can do this digitally, and then you can make the changes, and that's one of the best ways to learn, is where you have to implement the changes to the painting and not just have someone do it for you. You're very welcome, Brenda. Thank you for tuning in. I'm glad you're enjoying the critiques. And that's true, Stella. You learn from everyone's painting. I think people who don't sign up for the critiques don't realize how much value. I know a few of you do tune in who are not part of the critique groups formally, but I've had a lot of people write in and say, even though I'm not in the critique groups, I tune in and I learn a lot just from watching you edit other people. And I think that the reason for that is because we all kind of encounter very similar problems. And so you might be like, oh, I was struggling with that too, so maybe I can apply that to what I'm doing. So it is very useful. Just like in a real physical class, you have group critiques. It can be really useful to look at what other people are doing, talk about what's working and what's not working, and learn from it yourself. You're very welcome, Marianne. If you have follow-up questions, just post a progress shot in the forum. Don't worry about trying to catch up, everyone, to this weekend's lesson, though you might consider watching it just so you kind of know where we're headed. But just concentrate on making these changes and get as far as you can by next weekend. All right? Thank you, guys, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your Saturday or Sunday for those of you who are on the other side of the world. All right, thank you again. Have a good one. I'll see you guys next week.